an overall venue. So this is still an ongoing challenge.
Hello, Rabbi. Hello, Ken.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello, John.
Rabbi.
We're now streaming live on YouTube, so we're going to go. We're going to go straight to learning today's chapter, and as I mentioned, we're learning about second-generation wealth. The principle of what we're discussing in today's chapter is what happens if mommy leaves behind a nice inheritance for her children. Who does the money go to? In other words, the mother dies before her husband, but the husband has 2 wives. So now, what happens to that money? Meaning, he inherits this, and so now we're dividing the father's estate, okay? So both parents have died, the father and both mothers, and we're dividing the estate to both children. Okay, the children from each wife. And we give some very interesting conditions here. Halacha Aleph. One of the provisions of a woman's ketubah, sorry, 1 second. Sorry about that. So one of the provisions of a woman's ksuba is that her male offspring will inherit the money due to their mother by virtue of her ksuba, and the nedunya she brought to the house of the nichseit Saint Barzel. Only afterwards the children divide the remainder of the estate with their brothers equally. Okay, the nedunya meaning her wealth that she brought as nichseit Saint Barzel, which means the assets of the iron sheep. That name comes basically that it's an asset, a movable asset that comes in, or not, it doesn't have to be necessarily movable, but an asset that comes into the marriage. It's listed in the ketubah. The husband bears some responsibility for the maintenance of it, and then over the time accrues some of the value that to his own estate. Okay, but nevertheless, the sages decreed that when she dies, the value of it remains that of her children alone. So let's get into it. What is implied? A man married a woman whose ksuba and the dunya were together valued at 1,000 zuz. So basically, she brought in 800 zuz, which would be a few million rand worth. Excuse me. And she then died within her husband's lifetime. Okay. Afterwards, the man married another woman whose ksuba and dunya were together valued at 200 zuz. She bore a son, and then she died within her husband's lifetime. Afterwards, the man died, leaving an estate worth 2,000 zuz. His first wife's son should inherit 1,000 zuz by virtue of his mother's ksuba, and his second wife's son should inherit 200 zuz by virtue of his mother's ksuba, and the remaining 800 should be divided equally. Thus, the first wife's son will receive 1,400, and the second wife's son will receive 600 zuz. Everybody get that? Okay. When does the above apply? When the estate is worth at least 1 dinar more than the amount due the children by virtue of their mother's ksuba. If, however, there is not a dinar or more remaining in the estate, the entire estate should be divided equally without applying the provision mentioned above. What do we mean by this? There's something symbolic here. The rationale is that if the children of one of the mothers will inherit what is due them by virtue of the mother's ksuba, the other mother's children will inherit what is due them by virtue of their mother's ksuba, and at least 1 dinar will not remain to be divided among the heirs. Then this provision, which is a rabbinic origin will supersede entirely the equal division of the estate among the children that is required by scriptural law. In other words, Torah mandates a equal dividing of the estate, the father's estate. The father had the children; they're all equal children to the father. If the rabbinic legislation that mandates independent inheritance is going to the unique children of each mother, will then override the biblical division of the inheritance, then that rabbinic decree falls away. But what then the same law applies to a man who married many wives, whether one after the other, several at one time. If they have all died in his lifetime, they have all borne male children from this man. If his estate contains at least one dinar more than the ksubas of all his wives, each of the second sons inherits the money due to their mother by virtue of a ksuba. The remainder is divided equally, but halacha hey, should the estate not be large enough to satisfy the obligations of both ksubas and the additional dinners, and the heirs say, we will increase the value of our father's estate so that they will be more than a dinner, in addition to the value of ksubas, so that they can collect the money due their mother by virtue of her ksuba. Their request is not accepted. Instead, the estate should be evaluated in court according to its value at the time of the father's death, and the decision rendered on the basis of this figure. And even if the value of the estate increases or decreases in the time of the death of the father, the actual division of the property, the decision whether to grant the heirs to their mother ksuba depends only on the value of the estate at the time of their father's death. Okay. But if the value of the estate was a dinar or more than the sum of two ksubas, each of the sons inherits the money to his mother by virtue of her ksuba, even if there's a promissory note due against the estate. The amount that exceeds the value of the ksubas, it is not considered to have reduced the value of the estate. So the promissory notes do not, the IOUs to other individuals does not override this legislation. The following rule applies when a man was married to two wives. One died within his lifetime, and one died afterwards, and he has sons from both wives. Although the value of the estate he left, the value the two ksubas, the sons of the wife who died after her husband says have the right to inherit the money due their mother by virtue of her ksuba first, provided she took the oath required of a widow before she died. In other words, that there were no changes to it. The rationale is, meaning, why do we recognize the sons of the wife who died later more? The rationale is that they do not inherit their mother's ksuba by virtue of this provision, but rather through the Torah's laws of inheritance. Afterwards, the sons of the wife who died during her husband's lifetime, they inherit the money due to their mother by virtue of her ksuba on the basis of this provision, and if anything remains instead afterwards, it should be divided equally. In other words, those sons whose mothers died afterwards, they're inheriting by biblical law their mother's ksuba, whereas the other ones are only by rabbinic law. If the woman who died after her husband died before she was able to take the oath required of her, in other words, that she had never received her ksuba, only the sons of the woman who died in her husband's lifetime are entitled to inherit the money due to their mother by virtue of her ksuba. The remainder is divided equally. In other words, because we have no reason to believe that the woman who died later did not already collect her ksuba. The following rules apply when a man was married to two wives, fathered sons with both of them, and then died. If the wives died after the father did, but after taking the oath required of widows, each of their sons is entitled to inherit the money due to his mother by virtue of her ksuba, according to the laws of Torah's laws of inheritance, and not by virtue of this provision. Therefore, in this instance, it is not significant whether the estate is more valuable. Again, because we're not worried about Torah's inheritance being lost. The claim of the heirs of the wife married first takes precedence of the claim of the wife married afterwards. In other words, because that ksuba has precedent. In other words, the ksuba is dated earlier. If neither of the wives took the required oath, however, the sons of both women divide the entire estate equally as if there was no issue. Neither has the right to inherit his mother's ksuba, for a widow is not entitled to her ksuba until she takes the required oath. And if the husband died and she died and we don't know of her taking the oath, then doesn't come into play. In the above instance, if one of the widows took the required oath and one did not, the sons of the one who took the oath inherit the money, do their mother by virtue of ksuba first, and then the remainder of the estate is divided equally among the heirs. Whenever a son inherits money due to his mother by virtue of ksuba after she died in her father's lifetime, he doesn't have the right to expropriate property that was sold to others. He inherits only property in the possession of the estate. Yud. Among the provisions of the ksuba is that after the death of their father, his wife's daughters have the right to receive support for their sustenance from their father's estate until they become consecrated, until they reach the age of bagrut. In other words, bagrut, although in modern Hebrew today it means you're matric, but that means when they're old enough to be supporting themselves. If a daughter reaches the age of bagrut but has not been consecrated, or if she is consecrated before she reaches the age of bagrut, she is not entitled to receive her sustenance. When a daughter receives and consecrated here, when we were referring obviously to kiddushin, which is the first stage of marriage, at which point her husband would then be obligated to provide for her. When a daughter receives her sustenance from her father's estate after his death, however, her earnings and the ownerless object she discovers belongs to her, not to her brothers. Okay. Now we talk about taking care of the daughters. In other words, by Torah law, a woman's needs always must be provided for her. There's never a time that she's forced to provide for herself. An allotment of support, garments, and living quarters should be made for a man's daughters from his estate, just as it is made for his widow. His landed property may be sold to provide his daughters with their sustenance and garments without a public announcement, just as it is sold to provide for his widow's sustenance and garments. There is, however, one difference between the two. The allotment to the widow is made according to her social standing. In other words, they have to provide whatever she was used to and that of her husband, while his daughters are often given their necessity. His daughters are not, however, required to take an oath. Any questions? All good. Yud Beis. Men's sons are not entitled to inherit their money, do their money by virtue of ksuba, nor is the daughters entitled to receive their sustenance according to the provisions mentioned above, unless they manifest possession of the document according to the mother ksuba. If, however, they do not manifest possession of the document, they are not entitled for anything. It is possible that their mother waived her ksuba in favor of her husband. In a locale where it is not customary to record the ksuba in a document, however, their children are entitled to the benefits stemming from these provisions. Okay, now what about a living will? When shortly before his passing, a man orders that one of the provisions of his wife's ksuba be ignored, for example, given. He says, my daughters shouldn't derive their sustenance from my estate. My widow should not derive her sustenance from my estate. My sons should not inherit the money due their mother by virtue of a ksuba. His words are of no consequence. He's trying to take away what's rightfully theirs. Although a person gives his entire estate to others through an oral will, in other words, he's allowed to, all the provisions of his wife's ksuba must be met. The rationale is that the transfer of property through an oral will does not take effect until after death, as will be explained. Thus, the mandate of the will and the obligations of the estate, due to provisions of the ksuba, take effect simultaneously. Therefore, the widow and the deceased's daughters receive support for their sustenance from the estate, and the deceased sons inherit the money to their mother by virtue of her ksuba if she dies during her husband's lifetimes. So they get that, and it's allowed. Now, one of the controversial subjects which we touched on earlier is a child marriage. Again, the Torah does not encourage in any way child marriage. because it was prevalent at that time, Torah governs it. One of the points is that she is allowed to refuse. She is allowed to be mema'in, and a daughter of a girl who nullifies her marriage through miyun is considered like any other daughter, and she is entitled to support for sustenance after her father's death. Nevertheless, the daughter of a Yavama, the daughter of a Shni, and the daughter of one Zarusa, and the daughter of a woman who has been raped are not entitled to support for their sustenance after the father's death by virtue of this provision. During their father's lifetime, however, he is obligated to support them like any of his other sons and daughters. Okay, so this is just talking in terms of the liability that the estate carries. A man who consecrates a girl who is receiving sustenance from her brothers, it was obligated to provide her with support from the time of consecration onward. Although a husband is ordinarily required to support his wife only after Nisu, an exception is made in this insistence, because the girl is not entitled to support from her brothers after she becomes consecrated, and nor is she past the age of majority when she is capable of providing for her own sustenance, but rather she is a minor or a naida. Hence, her husband is obligated to support her, because a man would not desire that the woman he consecrated would put to shame, having to wander and beg for her support. So if he married her, he was obviously undertaking to provide for her. Tezayin. Should a daughter marry and then leave the right of her husband to the right of miyun, or be divorced or be widowed, even if she is obligated to marry a yavam, since she returns to her father's home and has not reached the age of bagrut, she is entitled to support from her father's estate until she reaches the age of bagrut, or until she becomes consecrated. When a man dies leaving both sons and daughters, the sons inherit the estate and it is their responsibility to provide their sisters. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, in the second generation, more of the obligations of the brothers to their sisters, either full sisters or half sisters. When a man dies, leaving both sons and daughters, the sons inherit his estate, and it is their responsibility to provide their sisters with support until they reach the age of bagrut, until they become consecrated. When does this apply? When the estate is large enough to provide both the sons and the daughters with their sustenance until the daughters reach age of bagrut. This is called an ample estate. Now, I just want to point out here, I know I repeated it again and again, the Torah, again, is talking about worst case scenarios. If you were flying to Joburg today, right, you'd go to the airport, you'd buy a ticket, and you'd enjoy the flight. It would be a wonderful experience. If you'd read through every term and condition and every line of the company's insurance policies, you might be afraid to go. Why? Because the fine print deals with worst case scenarios. And it's very important to remember that the Rambam here is not giving a guide for life with every line. Obviously, everything's a guide for life, but a guide for life ideally. Everything that he's talking about here is worst case scenarios. Who has to carry the ball? And as we'll see at the end of this halacha as well. If, however, the estate contains only a lesser amount, the funds necessary to support the daughter until the reach of the bagrut are set aside. In other words, it's put there aside, and the remainder is given to the sons. If the estate contains only enough to provide for the support of the daughters are entitled to sustenance until they reach the bagrut, or until they become consecrated, and the sons should beg for their support. Again, the Torah here is separating between genders and going with a principle that if the estate is so small that someone's going to end up begging, unfortunately, it will be the men and not the woman. When I say unfortunately, meaning a woman's dignity is given a bit of a, if you can call it, superior status when it comes to Nebuch, these orphans having to go and beg. When does the above apply? When the estate contains the landed property. If, however, the estate contains only movable property, since it is only by virtue of the ordinance of the Ga'ainin that the daughters are entitled to derive the support from the movable property, the sons and daughters should receive support equally from this meager estate. For with regard to movable property, the daughters were given the right to be considered like the sons, but not superior to them, and the Gaonim have ruled in this manner. Okay, so what we spoke about earlier of making that difference is only if there is property in the estate left. If a man left an ample estate of landed property, and the sons got their share, afterwards the value of the estate decreased until it became meager. Now it's not going to produce the same income. The heirs have already acquired the property. If the estate was deemed meager in value at the time of the man's death, and the value increased afterwards to the point that it's considered ample, the heirs are given the right to inherit it, even if the value did not increase. If the son sold an estate that was considered meager, the sale is binding. If the estate was ample but a debt was owed, or the man had made a provision with his wife, promising to support a daughter from a previous marriage, the debt or the obligation to support the widow's daughter does not prevent the estate from being considered ample. Instead, the sons inherit the entire estate. It is their responsibility to pay the creditor's debt, to support the widow's daughters for the time stipulated, and to support their sisters until they reach maturity, until they become consecrated and leave their domain. In other words, they carry that for as long as the girls need it. Again, a very sad scenario where a man left both a widow and from another marriage, a daughter. If a man left a widow and a daughter, either from her or from another wife, if the estate is not large enough to provide support for both of them, the widow should derive support from the estate, and the daughter will have to beg for alms. Similarly, I maintain that support for a man's daughter takes the precedence over his son's inheritance of their ksuba if she died in her husband's lifetime, although both rights are provisions of the ksuba. How does the Rambam reach his conclusion? From a kal v'chomer, this can be derived in making an inference from a more serious responsibility to a less serious one. If the inheritance of a man's estate, to which the sons are entitled by virtue of scriptural law, is superseded by the obligation to provide the daughter with her support, much more so should the son's inheritance of their mother's ksuba, which is only a rabbinic ordinance, be superseded by the obligation to provide the daughter with her support. So when it comes to a living widow, the widow has a superior status to the daughters. When it comes to the estate of a living widow, to the estate of a widow who's passed on, the ksuba, or the daughters, then the daughters take precedent. Misha Mes, somebody dies and leaves older daughters and younger daughters are leaving a son. We do not say the younger daughters should be guided their sustenance until they reach the Bagrut. And then the entire estate should be divided equally. Instead, the entire estate should be divided equally and immediately. In other words, daughters are all given the same equal treatment. Any questions?
Yeah, Rabbi, many questions. This is a field of my work that I do. To actually work out the amount that's required for sustenance of either the widow or the daughters is extremely difficult, whether at those days or even these days. It's very difficult to compute that. And it's almost as if, although we talk that the sons should inherit and not the daughters, the truth is the sons probably not, unless that's a very ample estate, the sons are actually not going to get anything because the money's got to be set aside for the widow and for the daughters. It's an interesting turnaround. And also, and the last point is the question of creditors really standing behind the widow and the daughters. So if you've got many daughters, I'm not going to lend you money.
Well, I have 5, so.
Hard luck. So it's fascinating.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for those comments.
Sorry, that was my question. Did you ask the same thing? Was that if the man's estate, if the man dies with a debt which is larger than his estate, are the sons, are the widow all the sons responsible, for that debt?
Yeah, they are. Definitely.
Yeah.
They most definitely are. And they need to carry that.
There might be in the state funds, but the debt would have to be paid first before the funds could be dispersed.
Totally. Yes, 100%. Okay.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day and a good Shabbos, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.